London, June 7th, 1594. The morning sun rises over Tyburn, casting long shadows across the infamous execution ground. A crowd has gathered, their faces twisted with anticipation and bloodlust. They have come to witness the death of a man who once stood at the pinnacle of Elizabethan society, a physician who held the life of the Queen herself in his healing hands. Today, that same man will be torn apart piece by piece in one of the most barbaric displays of state-sanctioned cruelty ever devised. His name is Roderigo Lopez, and his crime, they say, is treason. But the truth is far more complex, far more sinister, and infinitely more tragic. The air is thick with the scent of unwashed bodies and nervous excitement. Vendors hawk their wares, selling ale and bread to spectators who treat this gruesome spectacle as entertainment. Children perch on their fathers' shoulders for a better view. Women clutch handkerchiefs, whether in anticipation of tears or to shield themselves from the coming horror, no one can say. The scaffold stands waiting, a crude wooden platform that has claimed countless lives before this day. Beside it, the instruments of execution gleam dully in the morning light. The noose, the knife, the axe, and the cauldron of boiling water. This is not merely an execution. This is theatre. This is propaganda. This is the full weight of Tudor justice brought to bear upon a man who dared to rise too high, who possessed the wrong heritage, and who found himself caught in the deadly web of Elizabethan court politics. Roderigo Lopez's story is one of ambition and service, of prejudice and paranoia, of loyalty betrayed and innocence crushed beneath the wheels of political expedience. It is a story that begins not with treachery, but with healing hands and desperate hope. To understand how a trusted royal physician came to die in such horrifying fashion, we must journey back through the tangled corridors of power, through the whispered secrets of court intrigue, and into the very heart of one of England's darkest episodes of anti-Semitic persecution. We must understand not just the man, but the world that created him, elevated him, and ultimately destroyed him. This is the story of Roderigo Lopez, the Jewish doctor who served a Protestant queen and paid the ultimate price for daring to succeed in a world that could never fully accept him. Let us begin at the beginning, in a Portugal torn apart by religious persecution, where a young man of exceptional talent would be forced to make an impossible choice between his faith and his future. Roderigo Lopez was born around 1517 in Portugal, into a world of secrets and survival. He was a converso, a Jew who had been forced to convert to Christianity, or at least to present the appearance of conversion. His family, like thousands of others, lived in the shadow of the Inquisition, that terrible machinery of religious persecution that ground its way through the Iberian Peninsula, crushing bodies and souls with equal enthusiasm. To be a converso in 16th century Portugal was to exist in a state of perpetual anxiety, where any slip, any hint of Jewish practice could lead to investigation, torture, and death. The Portuguese Inquisition was established in 1536, when Lopez was still a young man. Unlike its Spanish counterpart, which had been terrorizing Jews and Muslims for decades, the Portuguese version arrived with sudden, devastating force. King João III, under pressure from Rome and driven by his own zealous Christianity, unleashed a wave of religious persecution that would fundamentally reshape Portuguese society. Jews were given an impossible choice: convert, leave, or face the consequences. But conversion was not enough. Even those who genuinely embraced Christianity were viewed with suspicion, their every action scrutinized for signs of crypto-Judaism, the secret practice of Jewish rituals behind closed Christian doors. Lopez, however, possessed a gift that would prove to be both his salvation and, ultimately, his doom. He was brilliant, particularly in the field of medicine. In an age when medical knowledge was rudimentary at best, when doctors still believed in the four humors and treated illness with bleeding and purging, Lopez demonstrated exceptional skill and learning. He studied at the University of Coimbra, one of the oldest and most prestigious universities in Europe, where he immersed himself in the works of classical physicians like Galen and Hippocrates, as well as the more recent advances made by Arab and Jewish medical scholars. But Portugal was no longer safe for a man of Lopez's background, no matter how talented. The Inquisition's reach was long, its methods brutal. Families were torn apart, property was confiscated. Those who refused to abandon their Jewish identity were subjected to auto da fe, the public ceremonies of penance that often ended in burning at the stake. Even conversos, who had lived as Christians for years, could find themselves accused of heresy based on the testimony of a jealous neighbor or a disgruntled business rival. The atmosphere was one of paranoia and fear, where trust was a luxury few could afford. Sometime around 1559, Lopez made the decision that would change his life forever. He left Portugal and sailed for England, joining the growing community of Portuguese conversos in London. England, under the rule of Queen Elizabeth I, offered something that Portugal no longer could: the possibility of a future. While England was by no means free of anti-Semitism, it did not have an Inquisition. The Protestant Reformation had severed England's ties with Rome, and while Jews were technically banned from the kingdom, conversos who presented themselves as Christians could sometimes find a place in English society. Lopez settled in London and established himself as a physician. His skills quickly became apparent. In an era when medical treatment was often more dangerous than the disease itself, Lopez demonstrated a level of competence that was rare. He understood the importance of observation and diagnosis. He was cautious in his treatments, avoiding the excessive bleeding and purging that killed as many patients as they cured. Word of his abilities spread, and his practice grew. He treated members of the Portuguese community in London, many of them fellow conversos, who preferred a doctor who understood their background and shared their experiences. But Lopez's ambitions reached far beyond treating Portuguese merchants and their families. He was a man who had already overcome tremendous obstacles, who had survived religious persecution and carved out a new life in a foreign land. He was fluent in multiple languages, including Portuguese, Spanish, Latin, and English. He was cultured, educated, and possessed of the kind of courtly manners that could open doors in Elizabethan society. Lopez wanted more than survival. He wanted success, recognition, and the security that came with royal patronage. And incredibly, against all odds, he would achieve it. Through a combination of skill, persistence, and fortunate connections, Roderigo Lopez would rise from Portuguese refugee to become one of the most trusted physicians in England, serving some of the most powerful figures in the realm. His ascent was remarkable, a testament to his abilities and his determination. But it would also make him vulnerable in ways he could never have anticipated, placing him at the center of forces beyond his control. By the early 1560s, Roderigo Lopez had established himself as one of London's most capable physicians. His practice flourished, and he began to attract patients from increasingly elevated social circles. His breakthrough came when he was appointed as house physician at St. Bartholomew's Hospital, one of London's oldest and most respected medical institutions. This position gave him both credibility and connections, allowing him to treat patients from all walks of life and to demonstrate his medical expertise on a daily basis. But Lopez's real opportunity came through his connection to Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, who was not only one of the most powerful men in England, but also widely believed to be Queen Elizabeth's longtime favourite and possibly her lover. Leicester suffered from various ailments, and Lopez's successful treatment of the Earl brought him into the inner circle of Elizabethan power. In 1581, Lopez was appointed as physician to the Queen herself, an extraordinary achievement for a Portuguese converso who had arrived in England as a refugee just 2 decades earlier. To be the royal physician in Elizabethan England was to hold a position of tremendous responsibility and equally tremendous danger. The Queen's health was a matter of state security. Any illness, any sign of weakness could embolden England's enemies and destabilize the realm. Elizabeth was unmarried and childless, ruling a kingdom surrounded by Catholic powers who questioned her legitimacy and plotted her overthrow. The succession was unclear, the political situation volatile. The royal physician had to be absolutely trustworthy, for he held the Queen's life in his hands with every treatment, every prescription, every diagnosis. Lopez took his duties seriously. He was cautious in his treatments, avoiding the drastic interventions that characterized much of 16th century medicine. He understood that the Queen's health was not merely a medical matter, but a political one. When Elizabeth fell ill, rumors spread like wildfire. Courtiers jockeyed for position. Foreign ambassadors sent urgent dispatches to their monarchs. The stability of England rested in part on the skills of this Portuguese doctor who had once fled the Inquisition. But Lopez's position at court gave him more than just medical responsibilities. He became involved in the murky world of Elizabethan intelligence and diplomacy. Elizabeth's spymaster, Sir Francis Walsingham, ran an extensive network of informants and agents across Europe, gathering information about Catholic plots, Spanish military preparations, and potential threats to the Queen's safety. Lopez, with his Portuguese background and his connections to the Converso community, was a valuable asset. He had contacts in Spain and Portugal, relationships with merchants and diplomats who moved freely between England and the continent. Lopez began to serve as an intermediary in various diplomatic intrigues. He passed messages, gathered information, and used his medical practice as cover for intelligence work. This was dangerous business in an age when discovery could mean death, but it also gave Lopez a sense of importance and belonging. He was no longer just a refugee physician. He was a trusted servant of the English crown, contributing to the security of his adopted homeland. He was naturalized as an English subject in 1584, a formal recognition of his status and service. By the late 1580s, Lopez had reached the pinnacle of success. He was wealthy, owning property in London and living in a style befitting his position. He had married a woman named Sarah, and they had children who were being raised as English Christians. He moved in the highest circles of society, treating not just the Queen, but also important nobles and ministers. He had survived the dangerous crossing from Portugal to England, had overcome prejudice and suspicion, and had built a life of security and prestige. But success breeds envy, and Lopez had accumulated enemies as he rose through the ranks of Elizabethan society. His foreign background made him vulnerable to accusations of divided loyalty. His involvement in intelligence work had exposed him to dangerous secrets and dangerous people, and his very prominence made him a target for those who saw in his downfall an opportunity for their own advancement. The stage was being set for Lopez's destruction, though he did not yet know it. The forces that would bring him down were already in motion, driven by ambition, prejudice, and the deadly logic of Tudor politics. Robert Devereux, the second Earl of Essex, was everything that Roderigo Lopez was not. Where Lopez had climbed through skill and service, Essex had been born to power and privilege. He was young, handsome, charismatic, and ruthlessly ambitious. He was also the stepson of the Earl of Leicester, Lopez's old patron, and after Leicester's death in 1588, Essex emerged as one of the most powerful figures at Elizabeth's court. He was, for a time, the Queen's new favorite, enjoying the kind of royal affection that could make or break careers. But Essex's position was never entirely secure. Elizabeth was a demanding and unpredictable monarch who played her courtiers against each other, granting and withdrawing favor as it suited her political purposes. Essex craved glory and recognition, particularly military glory. He saw himself as a great warrior and statesman, destined to lead England to triumph over its enemies. He chafed under the careful, cautious policies of Elizabeth's older advisers, men like William Cecil, Lord Burghley, who preferred diplomacy and patience to military adventurism. It was in the context of Portuguese politics that Essex and Lopez first came into conflict. Portugal had been absorbed by Spain in 1580, following a succession crisis after the death of King Sebastian. Many Portuguese, particularly those in exile, dreamed of restoring Portuguese independence. One such figure was Dom Antonio, the Prior of Crato, who claimed to be the rightful king of Portugal and lived in exile in England, supported by a pension from Elizabeth. Don Antonio's cause attracted various supporters and schemers, each with their own agenda. Lopez, as a prominent member of the Portuguese community in London, became involved in the complex politics surrounding Don Antonio. Essex, seeing an opportunity for military glory, became a passionate supporter of Don Antonio's cause, urging Elizabeth to back a military expedition to place Don Antonio on the Portuguese throne. Such an expedition would strike a blow against Spain, England's great enemy, and would cover Essex in the glory he craved. Lopez, however, was more cautious. He had lived through Portuguese political turmoil before, and he understood the risks. He also had his own connections and his own intelligence network, which sometimes conflicted with Essex's plans. The relationship between Essex and Lopez deteriorated rapidly. Essex saw Lopez as an obstacle to his ambitions, a Portuguese schemer who was playing his own game and undermining Essex's efforts to organize a military intervention. Lopez, for his part, viewed Essex as a reckless young nobleman who did not understand the complexities of Portuguese politics and who was dangerously willing to risk England's security for personal glory. Their conflict was personal, political, and ultimately deadly. In 1589, Elizabeth authorized a military expedition to Portugal, with Essex playing a prominent role. The expedition was a disaster. Don Antonio's promised support in Portugal failed to materialize. The English forces were unable to capture Lisbon. Thousands of men died from disease and combat, and the expedition limped back to England, having accomplished nothing. Essex needed someone to blame for this humiliating failure, and Lopez, with his Portuguese connections and his perceived obstruction of Essex's plans, made a convenient scapegoat. But Essex's enmity toward Lopez went deeper than a single failed military expedition. It was rooted in the fundamental insecurity of his position at court. Essex was always competing for Elizabeth's favor, always aware that rivals were plotting against him, always seeking to eliminate potential threats. Lopez's position as royal physician gave him regular access to the Queen, access that Essex could not control. Lopez heard the Queen's secrets, treated her ailments, and spoke with her in private. For a man as paranoid and ambitious as Essex, Lopez represented a potential rival, a foreign influence whispering in the Queen's ear. And so Essex began to watch Lopez carefully, looking for any opportunity to bring him down. He assigned his own intelligence agents to monitor Lopez's activities, to intercept his correspondence, and to build a case against him. Essex was patient, methodical, and utterly ruthless. He understood that to destroy a man as well connected as Lopez, he would need evidence, or at least the appearance of evidence. He would need to convince Elizabeth that her trusted physician was a traitor. And in the paranoid, conspiracy-haunted world of Elizabethan politics, that would prove easier than anyone might have imagined. In the early 1590s, England was gripped by fear of Spanish invasion and Catholic conspiracy. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 had been a great triumph, but Spain remained a formidable enemy, and Philip II of Spain continued to plot Elizabeth's overthrow. Catholic exiles schemed in foreign capitals. Jesuit missionaries infiltrated England to minister to recusant Catholics, and plots, both real and imagined, seemed to lurk around every corner. In this atmosphere of suspicion and paranoia, Essex saw his opportunity to destroy Roderigo Lopez. The case against Lopez began with the arrest of a Portuguese man named Esteban Ferreira da Gama in late 1593. Da Gama was captured carrying letters that suggested he was involved in some kind of plot related to Don Antonio and Portuguese politics. Under interrogation, and quite possibly under torture, da Gama began to talk. He mentioned the name of Roderigo Lopez, suggesting that the doctor had been involved in various intrigues with Spanish agents. Essex seized upon these accusations with enthusiasm, seeing in them the weapon he needed to bring down his enemy. Essex brought his suspicions to Elizabeth, but the Queen initially dismissed them. She knew Lopez well, had trusted him with her health for years, and found the accusations absurd. According to some accounts, she angrily rebuked Essex, calling him a rash and temerarious youth for making such wild charges against her physician. But Essex was not deterred. He continued his investigation, pressing his agents to find more evidence, to squeeze more testimony from prisoners, to build a case that Elizabeth could not ignore. The breakthrough came with the arrest of Manuel Luis Tinoco and Estevão Ferreira da Gama. These men were part of the murky world of international intrigue that surrounded Don Antonio and the Portuguese exile community. Under interrogation, they implicated Lopez in a plot to poison Queen Elizabeth on behalf of Philip II of Spain. The details of this alleged plot were vague and contradictory, but in the fevered atmosphere of the time, they were enough. Lopez was arrested on January 1st, 1594, and taken to the Tower of London. The Tower of London was one of the most feared places in England, a fortress that had served as prison, palace, and place of execution for centuries. Its walls had witnessed the deaths of queens and nobles, of religious martyrs and political prisoners. To be sent to the Tower was to enter a world of stone and shadow, where hope gradually faded and fear became the only constant. Lopez was placed in a cell and subjected to repeated interrogations. He was questioned about his correspondence with Spanish agents, about his involvement with Don Antonio, about every aspect of his life and work. Initially, Lopez maintained his innocence. He insisted that his contacts with Spanish agents had been part of his intelligence work for England, that he had been gathering information, not plotting treason. He pointed to his years of loyal service, his position as royal physician, his naturalization as an English subject. But Essex's agents were relentless. They interrogated him repeatedly, searching for inconsistencies in his story, pushing him to confess. And they had powerful leverage. Lopez was not a young man anymore. He was in his 70s, and the prospect of torture loomed over every interrogation session. The case against Lopez rested largely on the testimony of Ferreira and Tinoco, men who had every reason to tell their interrogators what they wanted to hear. They claimed that Lopez had agreed to poison Elizabeth in exchange for a large sum of money from Spain. They produced letters, though these letters were ambiguous and could be interpreted in various ways. They described meetings and conversations, though many of the details were vague or contradictory. Modern historians who have examined the evidence have concluded that the case against Lopez was extremely weak, based largely on circumstantial evidence and the testimony of men who were themselves under duress. But in 1594, in the Tower of London, the strength of the evidence mattered less than the political imperatives of the moment. Essex needed Lopez to be guilty. He had staked his reputation on proving the Portuguese doctor's treachery. To admit error now would be to lose face at court, to give his rivals ammunition, to weaken his position with the Queen. And there were others who benefited from Lopez's downfall. The anti-Semitism that lurked beneath the surface of Elizabethan society could be given free rein. A Jewish converso, regardless of his conversion, regardless of his years of service, could be portrayed as inherently treacherous, a secret enemy of Christian England. Under this relentless pressure, Lopez eventually confessed. Whether he confessed under torture, under threat of torture, or simply from exhaustion and despair, we cannot know for certain. But the confession, once obtained, sealed his fate. He was charged with high treason, accused of conspiring to poison the Queen and to betray England to its Spanish enemies. The trial would be a formality, the verdict predetermined. All that remained was to carry out the sentence, to make an example of this man who had dared to rise so high and who would now fall so far. On February 28, 1594, Roderigo Lopez was brought to trial at the Guildhall in London, along with his alleged co-conspirators, Ferreira and Tinoco. The trial was less a judicial proceeding than a political show, designed to demonstrate the government's vigilance against Catholic conspiracy and to satisfy the bloodlust of a population that had been fed a steady diet of anti-Spanish and anti-Semitic propaganda. The outcome was never in doubt. Essex had orchestrated the entire affair, ensuring that the prosecution had every advantage and that Lopez had none. The charges against Lopez were grave. He was accused of conspiring with Spanish agents to poison Queen Elizabeth I, of accepting money from King Philip II of Spain for this purpose, and of betraying England's secrets to the enemy. The prosecution presented the confessions of Lopez and his co-conspirators, along with letters and testimony from various witnesses. The Attorney General, Sir Edward Coke, led the prosecution, and he was merciless in his denunciation of Lopez, painting him as a treacherous foreigner who had wormed his way into the Queen's confidence only to betray her. What made Coke's prosecution particularly damning was its use of anti-Semitic rhetoric. Lopez was not just accused of being a traitor, he was accused of being a Jewish traitor, a crypto-Jew whose conversion to Christianity had been false, whose loyalty to England had been a sham. Coke referred to Lopez as a perjured and murdering villain, and worse than Judas himself, invoking the ancient anti-Semitic trope of the treacherous Jew. This was not merely about proving Lopez's guilt in a specific plot. It was about confirming every prejudice, every suspicion that many Englishmen harbored about Jews and conversos. Lopez attempted to defend himself, insisting that his contacts with Spanish agents had been part of his intelligence work for England, that he had never intended to harm the Queen, that his confession had been extracted under duress. But the trial was structured to make defense almost impossible. The rules of evidence were weighted against the accused. Lopez was not allowed legal counsel. Witnesses could not be cross-examined effectively. The jury, composed of London citizens who had been saturated with anti-Lopez propaganda for weeks, was predisposed to find him guilty. Throughout the trial, Lopez maintained that he loved the Queen better than he loved Jesus Christ. This statement, which was apparently meant to demonstrate his loyalty to Elizabeth, was instead used against him as evidence of his Jewish identity. After all, what kind of Christian would compare his loyalty to his monarch with his devotion to Christ, unless he secretly held no true devotion to Christ at all? Every word Lopez spoke was twisted, every defense turned into an accusation. The trial lasted only a single day, and the verdict was delivered swiftly, guilty on all counts. The sentence for high treason in Elizabethan England was one of the most horrific punishments ever devised by human cruelty. Lopez was sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered at Tyburn. This meant he would be dragged through the streets on a wooden hurdle to the place of execution. There, he would be hanged by the neck, but cut down while still alive. Then, in a display of savage brutality, he would be disemboweled, his entrails burned before his eyes, and finally, his body would be cut into quarters. His head and body parts would be displayed publicly as a warning to others. It was a sentence designed not just to kill, but to terrify, to humiliate, and to utterly destroy. After the verdict, Lopez was returned to the Tower to await execution. Elizabeth, despite signing the death warrant, seemed to have some doubts about the justice of the proceedings. She delayed the execution for months, an unusual act of mercy or perhaps uncertainty. Some historians suggest that Elizabeth never fully believed in Lopez's guilt, that she signed the warrant under pressure from Essex and his faction, but could not bring herself to immediately carry out the sentence against a man who had served her for so many years. but political pressure mounted, and finally on June 7th, 1594, the execution was scheduled. In his final months in the Tower, Lopez must have reflected on the terrible irony of his situation. He had fled Portugal to escape religious persecution, had rebuilt his life in England, had risen to the highest levels of society, had served his adopted country faithfully for decades. And now he would die as a traitor, condemned by the very system he had served. His Jewish heritage, which he had tried to leave behind, had been used as proof of his treachery. His success had made him a target. His very existence as a foreign-born physician to the Queen had marked him as dangerous in the eyes of men like Essex. June 7th, 1594, dawned clear and warm. The crowd began to gather at Tyburn early in the morning, eager for the spectacle. Lopez was brought from the Tower, placed on the hurdle and dragged through the streets. The crowd jeered and shouted abuse. Some threw stones or garbage. This was the end of Roderigo Lopez's long journey from Portugal to England, from refugee to royal physician to condemned traitor. All that remained was the execution itself, and the horror that awaited at Tyburn would exceed even the darkest imaginings of those who watched. To understand the full horror of what awaited Roderigo Lopez at Tyburn, we must understand the mechanics of hanging, drawing, and quartering, a form of execution that was specifically designed to maximize suffering, humiliation, and terror. This was not a quick death. It was not meant to be merciful. It was meant to be a public spectacle, a demonstration of the awesome power of the state and the terrible fate that awaited traitors. Every aspect of the punishment was calculated to prolong agony and to create a lasting impression on those who witnessed it. The condemned man would first be drawn through the streets to the place of execution on a wooden hurdle, a type of sledge that scraped along the ground. This journey was itself part of the punishment, subjecting the prisoner to the jeers and abuse of the crowd, dragging him through the filth of the streets, treating him like an animal being brought to slaughter. Lopez, an elderly man who had once walked the corridors of power, who had been respected and feared, was now reduced to this degraded state, pulled behind a horse while the population of London turned out to mock him. Upon arrival at Tyburn, the prisoner would be forced up a ladder onto the scaffold. The noose would be placed around his neck, and he would be pushed or thrown off, left to hang. But this hanging was different from a typical execution. The goal was not to break the neck and cause instant death. The goal was to strangle the victim slowly, to let him dangle and suffocate, his face turning purple, his body convulsing as it fought for air. The executioner would watch carefully, gauging the moment when the victim was near death but not yet dead. Too soon, and the victim would die before the rest of the punishment could be carried out. Too late, and there would be no suffering left to inflict. When the moment was right, the executioner would cut the rope and the half-dead victim would fall to the ground. This was the most horrific part of the execution, the part that gave the punishment its name, drawing. The victim's clothing would be stripped away, leaving him naked before the crowd. Then, while he was still alive, still conscious or semi-conscious, the executioner would take a knife and cut open his abdomen. The intestines would be pulled out and thrown into a fire that burned nearby. The victim, if he remained conscious, would watch his own entrails being burned. The pain would be unimaginable, beyond anything that can be adequately described. After the disemboweling, the executioner would reach into the chest cavity and remove the heart. This organ, the seat of life according to contemporary belief, would also be thrown into the fire. By this point, the victim was usually dead or dying, though there are accounts of men who remained conscious through much of this ordeal, their screams echoing across the execution ground. Finally, the body would be decapitated and then cut into 4 quarters. These body parts would be parboiled to preserve them and then displayed in prominent locations around London as a warning to others. The scaffold at Tyburn was a permanent structure, the infamous Tyburn tree, a triangular gallows that could accommodate multiple executions simultaneously. Over the years, thousands of people had died at this spot. Criminals and traitors, religious martyrs and political prisoners. The ground was stained with blood. The air carried the stench of death. This was where London came to witness the ultimate power of the state, to see what happened to those who defied the law or threatened the realm. Execution days were treated as public holidays, with vendors selling food and drink, spectators jostling for the best viewing positions. The crowd that gathered to watch Lopez's execution was particularly large and particularly hostile. The propaganda campaign against him had been effective, portraying him as a monstrous traitor who had plotted to poison their beloved queen. Anti-Jewish sentiment ran high. Many in the crowd probably did not distinguish between Lopez's official Christianity and his Jewish heritage. To them, he was a Jew, and therefore inherently untrustworthy, inherently foreign, inherently dangerous. They came to see justice done, or what they believed to be justice. They came to see a traitor die. As Lopez was prepared for execution, he would have been acutely aware of what was about to happen to him. He'd lived in England long enough to know the details of this form of execution. He knew that the next few minutes or hours would be filled with unimaginable pain. He knew that there would be no mercy, no last-minute reprieve. All that remained was to face his death with whatever dignity he could muster, to make whatever final statement he wished to make, and to endure the agony that was to come. As Roderigo Lopez stood on the scaffold at Tyburn on that June morning in 1594, he was given the opportunity to make a final speech, as was customary for condemned prisoners. This speech was supposed to serve as a confession and a warning to others, a public acknowledgement of guilt and a plea for divine mercy. But Lopez used his last moments not to confess, but to proclaim his innocence. According to contemporary accounts, he declared that he loved the Queen as much as he loved Jesus Christ. He maintained that he was innocent of the charges against him, that he had been falsely accused, that he was dying an innocent man. The crowd's reaction to Lopez's final speech was hostile. Many interpreted his words as further evidence of his guilt and his supposed Jewish identity. The statement that he loved the Queen as he loved Jesus Christ was taken as proof that he held no true Christian faith, that his conversion had been false, that he was still in his heart a Jew. The crowd jeered and shouted, calling for his death. There would be no sympathy, no recognition of the possibility of injustice. As far as most of those present were concerned, Lopez was a traitor who deserved everything that was about to happen to him. The executioner made his preparations. The noose was adjusted around Lopez's neck. The elderly physician, who had spent decades healing the sick and tending to the health of the powerful, was about to become a victim of the most savage form of state-sanctioned violence. At a signal, Lopez was pushed from the ladder. The rope tightened. His body dropped and then jerked to a halt as the noose caught his weight. He began to strangle, his feet kicking in the air, his face contorting as he fought for breath. Minutes passed. Long, agonizing minutes during which Lopez slowly suffocated while the crowd watched. The executioner, an experienced professional in the gruesome business of judicial killing, watched Lopez carefully. He needed to judge the precise moment to cut the rope. The moment when Lopez was near death but not yet dead, when he was too weak to resist but still conscious enough to suffer. It was a delicate calculation, the difference between a botched execution and a successful demonstration of state power. When the moment came, the executioner cut the rope and Lopez's body fell to the platform below, landing with a heavy thud. What happened next was almost beyond comprehension in its brutality. Lopez, semi-conscious and barely alive, was stripped naked before the crowd. The executioner took his knife and cut open Lopez's abdomen. Blood poured out onto the scaffold. The executioner reached inside and began to pull out Lopez's intestines, coil after coil of them, displaying them to the crowd before throwing them into the fire that burned nearby. The stench of burning flesh filled the air. Whether Lopez remained conscious through any of this, whether he was aware of what was being done to him, we cannot know. We can only hope that unconsciousness or shock had mercifully dulled his senses. The executioner continued his grisly work. He reached into Lopez's chest and removed his heart, the organ that had pumped blood through his body for more than 70 years, that had sustained him through his flight from Portugal, his rise in England, and now his terrible fall. The heart, too, was thrown into the fire. By this point, if Lopez had not already died from the hanging or from shock and blood loss, he died now. The executioner then took an axe and severed Lopez's head from his body. Finally, he quartered the body, cutting it into 4 pieces. Lopez's head and body parts were parboiled in a large cauldron to preserve them, then displayed at various locations around London. His head was mounted on a pike on London Bridge, where it would remain for years, a gruesome warning to anyone who might consider betraying the crown. The quarters of his body were displayed at other prominent locations. This was the final indignity, the final humiliation. Even in death, Lopez was to serve as an object lesson, his remains exhibited like the carcass of a slaughtered animal. As the crowd dispersed from Tyburn that afternoon, some satisfied that justice had been done, others perhaps troubled by what they had witnessed, the life of Roderigo Lopez came to its terrible end. The man who had fled the Portuguese Inquisition, who had built a new life in England, who had risen to become physician to the Queen herself, had been destroyed by a combination of political ambition, ethnic prejudice, and the paranoid atmosphere of late Elizabethan England. His execution was not an aberration. It was the logical conclusion of a system that valued conformity over diversity, that viewed foreigners with suspicion, and that was willing to sacrifice individuals to serve the political needs of the powerful. In the immediate aftermath of Lopez's execution, the Earl of Essex appeared to have achieved a complete triumph. He had successfully destroyed a man he viewed as an enemy and an obstacle to his ambitions. He had demonstrated his effectiveness as the Queen's protector, uncovering what he claimed was a dangerous plot against her life. His reputation as a vigilant guardian of England's security was enhanced, and he used Lopez's execution as evidence of his own importance and indispensability at court. For a time, Essex seemed to have consolidated his position as Elizabeth's favorite, but the Lopez affair would ultimately contribute to Essex's own downfall. His ruthless pursuit of the Portuguese doctor revealed the darker aspects of his character, his ambition, his paranoia, his willingness to destroy anyone who stood in his way. These same qualities would lead him into increasingly reckless behavior in the years that followed. Essex's military expeditions would continue to end in failure and humiliation. His relationship with Elizabeth would deteriorate as he overreached and demanded more power than any subject should possess. In 1601, just 7 years after Lopez's execution, Essex would himself be executed for treason after leading a failed rebellion against the Queen. The parallel between Essex and Lopez is striking. Both men rose high in Elizabeth's favor. Both men ultimately fell victim to the dangerous dynamics of Tudor politics. Both men died on the scaffold. But where Lopez was an innocent man destroyed by forces beyond his control, Essex was the architect of his own destruction, brought down by his inability to accept the limits of his power. There is a certain poetic justice in Essex's fate, though it came too late to help Lopez or to undo the terrible injustice of his execution. For the Portuguese and Jewish communities in London, Lopez's execution had a chilling effect. It confirmed their worst fears about the fragility of their position in English society. No matter how successful they became, no matter how long they had lived in England, no matter how thoroughly they had converted to Christianity, they could never fully escape their foreign origins or their Jewish heritage. Lopez's death was a reminder that acceptance was conditional, that success bred envy and suspicion, and that in times of political crisis, they could easily become scapegoats. Some members of these communities chose to leave England after Lopez's execution, seeking safer havens elsewhere in Europe. Others, withdrew from public life, avoiding any involvement in politics or court affairs that might attract dangerous attention. The Lopez case reinforced the lesson that survival depended on keeping a low profile, on not rising too high or attracting too much notice. It would be centuries before Jews could live openly and freely in England without fear of persecution. The execution also had cultural reverberations. William Shakespeare, who was at the height of his creative powers in the 1590s, wrote The Merchant of Venice around this time, probably in 1596 or 1597, just a few years after Lopez's death. The play features Shylock, a Jewish moneylender who is treated with contempt and ultimately defeated by the Christian characters. While Shakespeare's portrayal of Shylock is complex, and the play can be read as sympathetic to the Jew despite the anti-Semitic elements of the plot, there is no doubt that the play was written in the shadow of the Lopez affair and reflects the anti-Semitic attitudes that had been stirred up by the case. Some scholars have suggested that Shakespeare may have attended Lopez's trial or execution, or at least would have been familiar with the details of the case from the extensive publicity it received. The Merchant of Venice includes references to Jewish characters being forced to convert to Christianity, a clear parallel to Lopez's own situation. Shylock's famous speech about the common humanity of Jews and Christians takes on added poignancy when read in the context of Lopez's fate. Have we not eyes? Have we not hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions? If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die? But while the Merchant of Venice at least acknowledged the humanity of its Jewish character, the broader cultural impact of the Lopez case was to reinforce negative stereotypes. The image of the treacherous Jew who plots to poison Christians became a stock figure in English literature and drama. Lopez's case was cited for centuries afterward as proof of Jewish perfidy, even by people who knew nothing else about the historical details. The anti-Semitic propaganda that Essex and his allies had deployed so effectively to destroy Lopez lived on long after both men were dead. In the broader context of European history, Lopez's execution was one episode in a long and terrible story of Jewish persecution. From the expulsions from Spain and Portugal in the late 15th century, through the Inquisition, the pogroms of Eastern Europe, and ultimately to the Holocaust of the 20th century, Jews have repeatedly been made scapegoats, accused of crimes they did not commit, and subjected to horrific violence. Lopez's story is a microcosm of this larger pattern, a talented individual who tried to assimilate, to serve his adopted country, to build a better life, only to be destroyed by the very society he had tried to join. For centuries after his execution, Roderigo Lopez was remembered primarily as a traitor, if he was remembered at all. The official version of events, as recorded in Elizabethan chronicles and histories, accepted the verdict of his trial without question. Lopez had plotted to poison the Queen, had been in the pay of Spain, and had received the punishment he deserved. This narrative was rarely challenged, and Lopez remained a footnote in English history, notable mainly for the gruesome manner of his death and for his possible connection to Shakespeare's Shylock. It was not until the 19th and 20th centuries that historians began to seriously re-examine the Lopez case and to question the justice of his conviction. As more documents became available and as scholars developed more sophisticated methods of historical analysis, the weaknesses in the case against Lopez became increasingly apparent. The evidence presented at his trial was circumstantial and ambiguous. The testimony of his accusers was extracted under duress and was full of contradictions. The political motivations of Essex and his faction were obvious. Lopez's confession, which had been central to his conviction, appeared to have been coerced. Modern historians have reached a near consensus that Lopez was almost certainly innocent of the charges against him. His contacts with Spanish agents, rather than being evidence of treason, were part of his legitimate intelligence work on behalf of England. The alleged plot to poison Elizabeth was likely fabricated or exaggerated by Essex's agents, who were eager to please their master and who knew what kind of evidence he wanted them to find. Lopez was a victim of court politics, of ethnic prejudice, and of the paranoid atmosphere of late Elizabethan England. He was not a traitor, he was a scapegoat. But even this reassessment raises troubling questions. If Lopez was innocent, and if many people at the time had doubts about his guilt, why was he executed? Why did Elizabeth, who initially dismissed the charges against him, ultimately sign his death warrant? Why did the Privy Council, which included experienced and intelligent men, accept such flimsy evidence? The answer lies in the nature of power and politics in Tudor England, where the appearance of vigilance against threats was often more important than the reality of justice. Elizabeth was under constant pressure to demonstrate her strength and resolve. As an unmarried woman ruling in a patriarchal society, surrounded by powerful men who sometimes questioned her authority, she could not afford to appear weak or indecisive. The threat of Spanish invasion was real, and plots against her life, both genuine and fabricated, were a constant feature of her reign. In this context, the Lopez case served a political purpose. It demonstrated that the government was vigilant, that traitors would be caught and punished, and that the Queen's security was being protected. Whether Lopez was actually guilty was, from this cynical perspective, almost irrelevant. Moreover, Lopez's execution served Essex's political needs, and Essex was at that time one of the most powerful figures at court. Elizabeth's relationship with her favorites was complex. She valued their service and their loyalty, but she also used them against each other, playing rival factions off one another to maintain her own control. To deny Essex his victory over Lopez might have damaged her relationship with him at a time when she needed his support. The price of maintaining political balance was Lopez's life, and Elizabeth was willing to pay it. The Lopez case also reveals the role of anti-Semitism in Elizabethan England. While England did not have a large Jewish population in the 16th century, Jews, having been officially expelled in 1290, anti-Semitic attitudes were deeply embedded in English culture. These attitudes were religious in origin, based on Christian teachings about Jewish responsibility for the death of Christ. But they had taken on additional dimensions related to economic competition, foreign influence, and cultural difference. Conversos like Lopez, even those who had lived as Christians for decades, were viewed with suspicion. They were seen as inherently untrustworthy, as secret Jews who might betray Christian society at any moment. In this sense, Lopez's Jewish heritage was not incidental to his downfall. It was central to it. Essex and his allies knew that they could exploit anti-Semitic prejudices to make their case against Lopez more credible. They knew that many Englishmen would readily believe that a Jewish converso was capable of treachery. They used Lopez's ethnicity as a weapon against him, turning his background into evidence of his guilt. Lopez was destroyed not just by political ambition, but by a poison that had infected European society for centuries. The belief that Jews were fundamentally different, fundamentally dangerous, and fundamentally incapable of true loyalty to Christian societies. More than 4 centuries after his execution, Roderigo Lopez remains a figure of historical interest and a symbol of the dangers of xenophobia, anti-Semitism, and political persecution. His story has been told and retold by historians, novelists, and playwrights, each generation finding in it lessons relevant to their own times. In the 19th century, when Jewish emancipation was a live political issue in Europe, Lopez's case was cited as an example of historical injustice that needed to be rectified. In the 20th century, in the shadow of the Holocaust, Lopez's execution took on even darker significance as a precursor to the systematic persecution that would reach its terrible climax in Nazi Germany. Today, in an age of renewed concerns about immigration, ethnic scapegoating, and the persecution of minorities, Lopez's story continues to resonate. It reminds us that prejudice and political opportunism are a deadly combination, that societies can turn on their own members with shocking speed, and that success and assimilation offer no guarantee of safety when scapegoats are needed. Lopez did everything right by the standards of his adopted society. He was talented and hardworking. He converted to Christianity. He served his country faithfully, and yet when it became politically convenient to destroy him, none of that mattered. The manner of Lopez's death also serves as a reminder of the capacity for cruelty that exists within human societies. Hanging, drawing, and quartering was not an aberration or an act of random violence. It was a legally sanctioned punishment, carefully designed and systematically applied. It was carried out by professional executioners, watched by ordinary citizens, and justified by appeals to law and order. The brutality was the point. The suffering was intentional. This tells us something profoundly disturbing about the societies that created and used such punishments, and it should make us reflect on our own capacity for cruelty when we are convinced that we are serving justice or protecting our security. Scholars have debated whether Lopez's execution was primarily motivated by political rivalry, anti-Semitism, or genuine belief in his guilt. The answer is almost certainly that all three factors played a role, each reinforcing the others. Essex's political ambition gave him a motive to destroy Lopez. Anti-Semitic prejudice made it easier to believe in Lopez's guilt and to justify his execution. And the paranoid atmosphere of late Elizabethan England, with its genuine fears of Spanish invasion and Catholic conspiracy, created a context in which evidence could be manufactured and justice could be perverted. None of these factors alone might have been sufficient to bring about Lopez's death, but together they formed a deadly combination. The Lopez case also illustrates the importance of due process and the dangers of allowing political considerations to override judicial fairness. Lopez's trial was a travesty of justice. He was not given adequate opportunity to defend himself. The evidence against him was weak and circumstantial. His confession was almost certainly coerced, and yet he was convicted and executed because the political system demanded a conviction. This should serve as a warning about what happens when courts become instruments of political power rather than guardians of justice. In recent years, there have been calls for some form of official recognition of the injustice done to Lopez. While he cannot be formally pardoned, as that would require acknowledging that the Tudor legal system was fallible, his story has been increasingly recognized as one of historical injustice. Museums and historical societies have included his case in exhibitions about Jewish history in England and about the victims of political persecution. His grave, if he has one, is unknown, his body having been quartered and displayed around London. But his memory has been preserved, and his story continues to be told as a cautionary tale about power, prejudice, and the human cost of political ambition. Lopez's family suffered from his downfall. His property was confiscated, leaving his widow and children in poverty. His name was disgraced, and his descendants had to live under the shadow of his supposed treason. Some of them may have left England, seeking to escape the stigma. Others may have tried to rebuild their lives as best they could. We know little about what became of them, as they disappeared from the historical record, probably deliberately keeping a low profile to avoid their father's fate. The physical evidence of Lopez's execution has long since disappeared. The scaffold at Tyburn was eventually torn down. London Bridge, where his head was displayed, has been rebuilt multiple times. The locations where the quarters of his body were exhibited are now occupied by modern buildings, but the memory of what happened on June 7, 1594, survives in historical records, in chronicles and letters, in court documents and trial transcripts. These dry, bureaucratic texts preserve the terrible details of Lopez's final hours, allowing us to reconstruct the horror even across the gulf of centuries. In the end, Roderigo Lopez's story is a tragedy in the classical sense. It is the story of a man of talent and ambition who rises to great heights only to be brought down by forces beyond his control. It is the story of how quickly success can turn to disaster, how easily trust can be betrayed, and how the powerful will sacrifice the weak when it serves their purposes. It is a story about the dangers of ethnic hatred and political paranoia, about the fragility of justice in times of crisis, and about the capacity for cruelty that lurks within supposedly civilized societies. Most of all, it is a reminder that we must be vigilant in protecting the rights of minorities, in demanding fair legal processes, and in resisting the temptation to sacrifice individuals on the altar of political expediency. Roderigo Lopez deserved better from the society he served so faithfully, and we dishonor his memory if we fail to learn from the injustice that destroyed him.